Let me start with a question to get us thinking about the text that we're going to explore today. And the question is this: how do you grow a business or a brand? How would you boil down to the most basic explanation of marketing so that you could help a business or a brand to grow? Well, I'm going to oversimplify it, but it's because we need to. We don't have all day to do a marketing lecture. So here's the oversimplified version of how that happens. First, you do something, or you have something, that will be likable to as many people as possible. You want your services or your product to be something that will fill in a gap in the market somewhere, so a lot of people will like it. That seems easy enough. The second thing is, once you've got that, you want to increase your visibility. You want to make sure that you advertise yourself in as many places as your resources will allow so that people will know about this likable thing or service that you have to offer. And then the third one is, when you're doing that marketing and raising your visibility, you want to make sure that you paint just the right picture of the product or the service that you have. You don't want to talk at all about any negative or possible negative outcomes or aspects of it. You want to paint an entirely and only positive picture of what you've got. Like, for instance, if you're trying to advertise a new menu item for a restaurant and it's not the healthiest thing in the world, you don't really want to talk about that, do you? You want to talk about how delicious it is, right? It's that kind of a thought process. That's what I'm talking about. So with those three strategies in mind, and again, I know that's very oversimplified, but it works. With those three strategies in mind, let me ask you this question. Do those work as mentalities for how to grow a church? That's an interesting kind of question, isn't it? Because in some ways, we would kind of initially be like, no, the church isn't a business. You don't grow it the same way. We don't want to do any of that. But there's actually not everything wrong with all of those different ideas, right? So when you have a little bit of wisdom here, it's not all or nothing in this regard. There's some advertising that we can do. When we have special events, we want to let people know about it. We want to make sure that we can put some content out there that people would know they could come here if they want to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. We want to make sure that there's some visibility there. But I don't think that last one, I'm just accentuating every positive and not talking about any possibility of anything negative, that's not really what we're about, is it? Because what we need to do is preach the entire truth. And we need to preach the whole counsel of God. And so, yeah, I know we might use some tools of advertising and marketing. It's good for us to be aware of what channels of outreach are available to us. Those sort of techniques have their place. But when it comes to growing a church, is that really the thing we need to be thinking about? Do we need to always be thinking marketing for growing a congregation of God's people? And my answer, by and large, is no. Because when I look through the Bible, and when I look at the church from the perspective of God, how does God describe His church growing? When they are being faithful to Him and they're doing it right, how does God describe a congregation and His universal church growing? Heaven's perspective, brothers and sisters, shows us that the best way for the church to grow is very simple, and it is so powerful. It's people talking to people about Jesus. Marketing? Yeah, you can take it or leave it. But people talking to people about Jesus Christ. It's not the same thing as making a sale or closing a deal with the gospel. Those are different motivations here. That's the mentality that mostly says, let me convince you of something so that I can win this in some way. That's not what we're after. What we're after is letting people know that this is what makes my life worth living to me. Can I tell you about it? Can I share that with you? The best method is as simple as that. It's just people talking to people about Jesus. That's been the method for church growth for over 2,000 years. It's simple. It's organic. It works in every single culture across the map. It's people talking to people about King Jesus. Now, there are two exceedingly familiar verses in the New Testament that demonstrate the importance of this. The first one is, it's one of the last things that Jesus says before he ascends into heaven. He tells the apostles, go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. That's our job. That's what we're supposed to do. That's the reason that we're in this world, is to glorify him by bringing lost souls to know him. And then the other one is the scripture that Tyler read from just a minute ago from Acts chapter 8, when it says, those who were scattered because of persecution went about preaching the word. Why did they do that? Because it was their nature. It was their very nature to go about telling other people about Jesus Christ. And so today, I'm going to take a jump-off point from one verse late in the book of Acts and use it to remind all of us to do this important work of evangelism. People say this all the time, and I'm going to say this as well. It's important for us to remember that in a congregation, there's usually somebody who is called the evangelist. That would be my role in this place, and I get that. But let's just be very clear. All of us are meant to be evangelistic. Every single Christian is meant to be evangelistic. And so today, as that's our goal and that's what we're doing, I want to offer a little bit of perspective that can help us with that. So would you turn your Bible to Acts chapter 28? If you're using one of the Bibles from our pews, that's going to be page 882. Acts chapter 28, I want to read you just a couple of verses as the whole thing is wrapping up. This is getting very near the end of what we know of the Apostle Paul's life and his work. At this point, he's in prison for his efforts in teaching the gospel, and yet he's doing what he always does, and he's doing exactly what works to grow God's church in this world. He is talking to people about his King Jesus. And so, starting in verse 23 of chapter 28, this is what we're told. When they had appointed a day for him, they came to him at his lodging in greater numbers. And from morning till evening he expounded to them, testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. And then here's the key verse that I want us to think about with the rest of our time this morning. Verse 24. And some were convinced by what he said, but others disbelieved. That's the sermon text for this morning, just verse 24. Some were convinced by what he said, but others disbelieved. Really, Dan, you're going to preach a whole sermon out of that one verse? You bet I am. Here we go. Because I think there's so much that we can learn from this. This sounds like, if you're really processing it, this could be a summary of the entire book of Acts before this. That some people were convinced and others disbelieved. That could be a summary of the whole book of Acts. But I think it gives us two very important and exceedingly simple lessons for how we approach the world and how we think about our own work of evangelism. So let's start with the second lesson that we can learn. We'll go from the end of the verse and work our way up to the top. The first lesson in evangelism from this verse, some will reject the truth. You know, when we teach people and they don't obey the gospel, we would love to believe that it's just because they don't know enough. If they had more information, if they had more knowledge of the Bible, they would for sure become Christians. Or if we taught it to them with just the right system, right? I string together just the right passages of Scripture in just the right order. I don't take too long. I don't go too short. And I give it to them in just the right form, flip charts or whatever it takes, right? Every single person that hears will become a Christian. We would love to think that if everybody just had the right info in the right way, everyone would respond to the gospel the same, because if they knew what I know, then they'd be a Christian like I am. But it ain't necessarily so, to quote an old musical, okay? Look again at the verse we just read, at verse 24. It doesn't say that some people didn't have enough info. It doesn't say that Paul did a better job teaching some, but not as well with these people. It doesn't say that it was a matter of knowledge. What does it say? It says that some disbelieved. And that's a choice, brothers and sisters. It's a choice that some people make not to believe the truth. For evidence of this, by the way, that it's not always just up to the teacher and it's not just a lack of knowledge, I would point you to the life of Jesus himself. Why did the Jews reject Jesus? It was not because they had too little Bible knowledge, okay? I guarantee that nearly everybody on the council that put him to death knew the Old Testament better than any of us in this room. I guarantee that they knew their prophets and the Psalms much better than we do. So it wasn't a lack of Bible knowledge that made them put him to death. What was it? It was jealousy. It was ego. It was pride. It was selfishness. It was some sort of fear. All of those are bad motivations, but that's the reality of the story, isn't it? That it wasn't a lack of knowledge that kept them from believing in Jesus, was it? And it wasn't a lack of good teaching. Whose teaching were they listening to? Jesus. There's not been a better teacher. It wasn't a lack of knowledge. And it wasn't a lack of good teaching. It was a choice that they make. And I'm telling us that harsh reality because sometimes we need to hear one. I think that's the harsh reality that Jesus would tell us too. That when we teach the gospel to some people, we will be rejected because the message is being rejected. We will be rejected because they don't believe in the truth. Now, can I just tell you that as somebody who has tried to teach people the gospel repeatedly, has tried and people from all different varying levels of faith or belief, that when you try to bring somebody to a greater level of faith, and especially when you try to bring them out of unbelief into faith, when you see them choose not to believe it, that stinks. Man, that's hard to process. Because you know you're trying to help them. You know you're trying to give them something good and worthwhile, and you believe it, and the more you teach it, the stronger that belief gets. And so when they decide not to go for it, oh, that's hard to process. That's hard to take in. But it's a whole lot easier pill to swallow if you know that it's coming. And so I'm just reminding us that sometimes we just need to be ready for the fact that some people will decide not to believe in Jesus. Sometimes that's just the choice that they make. Sometimes their motivations are the same, right? Maybe it's because of jealousy. Maybe it's because of fear. Maybe it's because of their own ego and arrogance, or they're afraid of losing popularity, or they're afraid that if I become a Christian, I won't get to do this thing that I love so much, this pleasure that I enjoy in my life. Maybe it's all of those things. But the reality for then and for now and for always is that some people will disbelieve. So the question is, what do we do with that? When we know that, if it's right there and it says, even with the Apostle Paul, even with Christ himself, there were some who disbelieved, what do we do with that realization? Let me give you 4 quick pieces of advice here, okay? And this is hopefully there to motivate us to keep teaching in spite of this being true. The first one is, ask direct questions when you have Bible studies and Bible discussions with people. Just ask people point blank, what do you believe about Jesus? What do you believe about the Bible? What do you believe about God? Now, my experience so far has been that even if people don't want to talk about it, they'll at least answer that question point blank. Because a lot of times they can answer that question point blank and they know you'll leave them alone after that, right? But at the very least, they'll say, I don't believe that it's true, and I'm not interested in being convinced. Okay, well then good. Now I know, okay? So I'm just saying, let's save ourselves some time and just ask some direct questions. What do you believe about Jesus, about the Bible, about God? Ask some direct questions and find out where people are at. Second, when we're doing evangelism, since we know that some people are going to reject the truth, let's make sure that we don't measure the success of evangelism by the results of evangelism. Let's measure our success by the effort we put into it. Now, this is an ongoing conversation that preachers have when we get together. And there's 2 sides to this, where some people are saying, well, listen, if you're saying you don't measure by the results of evangelism, that's just a cop-out because you don't want to work as hard, you don't want to get the results. I disagree entirely. My feet are firmly planted in the camp that says the way to measure whether you've been doing what you should is, are you teaching people the gospel? Listen, brothers and sisters, the sower went out to sow. How much of that seed did not yield a crop? 3/4 of it. Was he wasting his time, though? No, not at all, because some of that seed yielded 30-fold, some 60, and some 100-fold in the end of Jesus' parable. Go look that up in Matthew chapter 13. So is it worth the effort? Yes, it's always worth the effort. And we need to make sure that we see that not by measuring how many baptisms did we get in a certain amount of time, or not by measuring how many people out of how bad a situation were we able to convert in this place. That's not the goal. The goal is to go and teach them. Let the decision of whether they'll accept or reject the truth be between them and God, but go teach them and help them. And don't hold back. Now, carefully, I'm adding this next point here, okay? Because sometimes, once we've done that, and once we've asked those direct questions, sometimes what we're going to find out, and this is not a cop-out, and if you use it as a cop-out, shame on you, truthfully. This is not a cop-out, but it is godly wisdom, that sometimes, when you know it's best to let go, you better just let go. Some were convinced by what Paul said, but some disbelieved. Listen, sometimes when somebody's made the decision that they're not going to accept Jesus' truth in their lives, we need to let that go. We need to let that be between them and God. I heard a story, an older preacher told me this story about how he got a phone call late on a Saturday night that there was a group of members of his church that were studying with their neighbor. They lived in the same neighborhood, so it's like two families, and they're studying with this other neighbor. And they wanted him to come over because they felt like he could maybe get through to them in a way that they hadn't been able to so far. So he walks into the living room, and they're sitting in a circle with him in a chair in the middle of the room. And they're just nailing him one time after another with Bible passage after Bible passage and argument after argument. And so he said, I came in and I looked at the guy in the middle of the room and I said, let me ask you a question. Do you want to believe in Jesus? And the guy said, no, but they won't leave me alone. And some of you will know this name, Brother Bowman. Brother Bowman said, well, I'm not sticking around here. He's made his mind up. We should all go home. And so they did. Listen, sometimes we need to just know when to let go. Some of us are like that. We're like a little terrier dog that gets bit onto somebody's pant leg and won't let it go till the pants rip or you just die. And we need to do better than that. Sometimes godly wisdom is don't just keep badgering somebody like that. You know? What we want, brothers and sisters, and I mean this one to sink in big time right here. What we want is for people to come to Jesus, not succumb to us badgering them. Okay? And let's just make sure that we know the difference there. The Lord told the apostles on one occasion, He sent them out, the apostles and many more, 72 people He sent out to go and teach in the villages around where they were. And this is Luke chapter 9 and verse 5. And He told them, go into the villages and teach. Well, if they didn't, they wouldn't be doing what He said. So we need to hear that part of it too. But He also told them, if you go into those villages and they reject you, then when you leave the village, shake off even the dust from that town and leave it with them. Because that's between them and God now. But you go and teach the gospel. And we need to see the same thing. You win some and you lose some in evangelism, and that's okay. Because some were convinced by what the Apostle Paul said, but others disbelieved. Now, the fourth thing that we need to learn from that, in terms of applications for our own lives, is don't let that stop us from teaching. And that's where we go back to the first half of this verse, because there are going to be always, brothers and sisters, there are always going to be people who will believe the truth. In many areas of life, and I could give hundreds of examples here, we could come up with so many of these if we started putting our heads together. There are so many places in life where we let the possibility of failure stop us from pursuing success. Now, I know that, again, we could do 100 different examples of that, but it's especially true with evangelistic outreach. And yet, we better make sure that we don't let that thought process stop us. Why? Because the gospel of Jesus Christ does save people, brothers and sisters. That was true back then, and it is always true. The gospel of Jesus Christ saves people. It has worked for 2,023 years, and we're going to keep teaching it because it will continue to work. Now, maybe this is one of those things that discourages some of us because, you know, again, I'm a little afraid of failure, so I don't want to go for it. But listen, I hope this actually is one of those things that encourages all of us, because you never really know who you're going to impact when you take the time and the opportunity to share the gospel with somebody who needs to know about it. You never know who will become a Christian and be saved by Jesus Christ. Often it is the most unexpected hearts that will be transformed by the power of the gospel. For an example of that, just look at the cast of New Testament characters. Now, I know that we could probably have gone through and predicted some of those people that would be, ripe candidates for obeying the gospel. Some of them are Jews steeped in Judaism, and so when they hear that the Messiah has come, they are so ready and so excited to receive him and see who he really is. Remember those two old folks that the baby Jesus was introduced to in the temple? I'm thinking of people like that. Their names were Anna and Simeon. And I just love those stories because they knew the truth. They were waiting for God to reveal his Messiah, and when he did, they were excited. There are people like that who receive it, and I think we should expect that of some of them. Some, thank you. Exactly, brother. That's exactly right. Because then you go to Peter. Peter is impetuous. Peter is flighty. Peter is flaky. And yet, Peter's one of the writers in the New Testament. You go to the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, the beginning of the chapter, in those same verses that Tyler read earlier, the Apostle Paul was ravaging the church, dragging people off to prison just for believing in Jesus. And weeks later, just weeks later, he's getting taken to prison because he's preaching about Jesus. You take a look at James. You take a look at Simon the Zealot. You take a look at any of the apostles. So many of them seem like unlikely candidates to become faithful ones to Jesus, and yet they were the ones he sent out into the world to go teach the world. Listen, if we can't predict the cast of the New Testament characters, then there's no way we can predict who's going to be faithful and who's not among our friends and neighbors and classmates. So what do we do with that? Well, we go teach all of them. That's what we do. We go teach every single person that will listen to Jesus. Would it have been fair to look back at any of the New Testament people and say, well, it'll never work with them. They're too far gone. They're too steeped in whatever problem they have. I've recently been studying the book of Acts with a handful of members, and one of my favorite characters that I've seen in the book of Acts is Simon the magician from the city of Samaria. You want to talk about somebody that's steeped in darkness, whose life is consumed in many ways by darkness, and yet he becomes a Christian. And he becomes such a convicted Christian that when the apostles point out sin in his life, he says, oh my goodness, please pray that none of the bad things of judgment that you've just said will happen to me. I don't want that. He's repentant, he's broken, he's sorrowful, he wants to obey God. Would it have been fair to look at any of those people and say, it'll never work with them? Nope. But Christ's kingdom has always been like that. It's a place for everyone who receives and believes the truth about Jesus. It's not fair for us to look around at our world and say, well, it'll never work with that person. It'll never work in that neighborhood. It'll never work in that town. It's not fair, and it's not healthy. All of that points to the fact that some will believe the message of Jesus when we share it. Now, I fully get, let me just throw this out there as well, I fully get that there are some people that will never have a deep understanding of the deep things of God, okay? I think probably most of us have known some Christian in our life that was faithful, but they didn't really understand a whole lot of God's things. But they were faithful, and they did their best, and they believed in Jesus, and they were convicted by what someone told them about the truth. And their faith was authentic, and they acted on that faith. And if that's the people we know, brothers and sisters, if that's who we are in fellowship with in the church, then God bless them, because they're saved. If their faith is real and it's active and it's obedient to God, then they're saved. And God's grace is all the rest. Maybe they don't understand the deep things of God. Maybe you don't either. That's fine. Keep pursuing it. But if you're not actually capable of getting there, that is okay. If somebody else isn't actually capable of getting there, that is okay. Because it doesn't say that some were convinced because they really got the deep stuff that Paul was teaching them. No, it says they were convicted by what he said. About what? About Jesus. And if their faith is real, then it's enough. And God's grace is all the rest. Some disbelieved, but others were convinced by what he said. So what do we do with all of that? 4 applications here. I'll make them quicker this time. Here we go. 4 applications here. Number 1, get to know people. Actually know your friends and your neighbors and your classmates and the people you work with. Don't live in a spiritual cocoon, okay? No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket. Go let the light shine in the world around you. Get to know people. Develop relationships. Help non-believers in life. Be the people that they can trust and they can depend on. Get to know people around you. Stay unstained from the world, but stay engaged with the world so that we can teach them. Number 2, create visibility for Bible studies and conversations about the faith. Here's what I mean by that. I have found it so helpful to be in coffee shops and Chick-fil-A dining rooms. I know I'm a little bit obsessed with Chick-fil-A. I'm sorry. I found it so helpful to be in coffee shops and restaurant dining rooms with my Bible out on the table. You know why? Because people will come up and they will ask you something about the Bible. And you have an open door to continue the conversation, to engage in some sort of dialogue that will help them come closer to Jesus. Just be in some place. That's not the only way to do it, but it's one easy way. Be in some place, be in some express openness in some way in your life, so that people can know they can talk to you about Jesus Christ. And then here's the third one. When they do approach you, talk about Jesus Christ. Tell them what you love about Him. Tell them what you respect about Him. Tell them the good that He's brought into your life. Tell people about Jesus. And then the fourth one, I'll put some words in your mouth here so that you can use this to start conversations. Just ask somebody, can I share my faith with you? Now, they might say no. That's sermon point number 1 for this morning, some disbelief. They may say no. That's okay. But some will say yes. And I'll say to you the same way I said it several weeks ago. When you look at times in the New Testament, when somebody asked, what do I have to do to be saved? I think, brothers and sisters, if we're ready to answer that question, more people will be ready to ask that question. I think if we're ready to answer it, that God will give us more people who are ready to ask it. So ask them, can I share my faith with you? And then be ready to do exactly what you've just offered, to share your faith with them. Now, I made this point a little while ago, and I want to make it again one more time here. If you're done, you can go ahead and fold it up, but just tune back in with me. Because I think one more thing that we need to realize on this second point is the same thing I've already said once, that you really never know the blessing that a simple conversation can have with somebody. You never know who you might bless with an eternity in heaven by just being willing to talk about things that really matter. I want to read you a bit of history here for a second. To win 4 gold medals at a single Olympic Games would be an astonishing thing for anybody. However, to do so as a black man in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin was that much more impressive. In 1936, Hitler was the Chancellor of Germany, and his beliefs about Aryan superiority were widely known. And it had been publicized by the German government, in fact, that he did not want Jews or black folks at the game at all. He didn't want them there. Yet, an American runner named Jesse Owens ran that year and won gold in the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the 4x100 relay, and the long jump, all in the space of a few days, on a few occasions with Hitler actually in the stadium. Now, here's the interesting bit of that story. After his first attempt at the long jump, a German competitor named Lutz Long noticed a flaw in Jesse Owens' technique, and he came over to give him a little bit of coaching that helped him jump farther on the next run and actually helped Mr. Owens win gold. A German competitor who was the paragon of Aryan, expectations, came over and gave coaching to somebody who wasn't supposed to be there, quote unquote. So much so that he won the gold medal. Now, having bonded so well at the games, Owens and Long kept in touch by mail after that was over. And so I have here a printout of Mr. Long's last letter, because a handful of years after the games, he was sent to fight in the German army in North Africa during World War II. And so I just want to read you the last letter that he wrote that was sent to Jesse Owens and took over a year to get there, but this is what it said. I am here, Jesse, where it seems there is only the dry sand and the wet blood. I do not fear so much for myself. I fear for my woman who is home and my young son Carl, who has never really known his father. My heart tells me, if I am honest with you, that this is the last letter I shall ever write. If it is so, I ask you something. It is something so very important to me. It is that you go to Germany when this war is done. Someday find my son Carl and tell him about his father. Tell him, Jesse, what times were like when we were not separated by war. Tell him how things can be between men on this earth. That hour in Berlin when I first spoke to you, when you had your knee upon the ground and knew that you were in prayer, then I know not how I knew, now I do. I know it is never by chance that we come together. I came to you in that hour in 1936 for a purpose more than the Berlin Olympiad. And you, I believe, will read this letter while it should not be possible that it should reach you, for purposes even more than our friendship. I believe that this shall come about because I think now that God will make it come about. I think I might believe in God. And I pray to Him that even while it should not be possible for this to reach you ever, these words I write will be read by you, your brother Lutz. Years later, per his request, Owens went back to Germany and he found Carl. And they became such good friends that he was the best man at his wedding. You never know how you are going to touch somebody's life. Amen. And if that story chokes us up, brothers and sisters, then how much more if we're telling them the good news of eternity. Amen. And that's how we touch their lives. How much more would it be true of a conversation about our King Jesus? And so go and make disciples of every nation, teaching them to obey all that He has commanded us, and baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And He is with us always to the end of this age. And some were convinced by what He said. Yeah, that's what we want to. It's not about making a sale, y'all. It's about helping people transform their hearts and give their lives to King Jesus. So, let's go turn the world upside down. Okay? We don't need a special program, a special effort. You need to hold on to this. You need to walk around with it and say, let me just read you some stuff out of this. You know? Go talk to people about Jesus and let's turn the world upside down. Some will disbelieve, but some will be convinced by what we say. Let's go find those people. May God give us the strength to share the gospel for the glory of God. If you're somebody today that's ready to give your life to Him and that's ready to be baptized and have your sins washed away and your eternity with Him set so that you can be with Him when this life is over, then we want to give you an opportunity to do that. You can come forward and let us know about it while we stand and sing this hymn together.